All right, everyone. Welcome to the Optics Pre-Derby Chat. I'm your host, Jason Beem, with the Bet America Radio Network, and I'm thrilled to be here with three of my handicapping buddies and the great folks from OptixEQ. We're going to talk about the Kentucky Derby as it sits right now. Obviously, still over a week till the race, but we're having our pre-Derby chat, talking about all the contenders. We'll talk about the Optics plot. We'll get our handicappers' opinions on several different topics, including works the next week leading up to the race, things they're looking for, a little bit of history and trends, maybe even weather, and we'll talk about all that. So let's welcome in and introduce you to who's joining us on the call today. We'll start out with NHC former champion and one of the proprietors here of OptixEQ, John Doyle, joining us. John, how are you?
Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Doing good, man. We're excited to have you on. I got to have you on my show a little while back, so I'm excited to be here with you guys.
I love having you.
Let's also welcome in as well from Optics, doing trip notes and handicapping, and does a lot of work with us at Brisnet and Churchill Downs. Emily Gullickson joining us. Emily, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jason.
Well, I'm excited to pick your brain on a number of these things. You've kind of been my optics tutor a little bit, so I'm glad to have you here. I feel like it's a good learning environment with you here.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad you can be, figuring out optics and be another advocate for us. So it's helpful. You can carry that teaching skill on to the next person.
And we want to make sure that we have some looks to go with all the talent here. So we brought in a great clocker and a handsome gentleman, Donald Harris. Donald, how are you?
You know what? Let's quit the pleasantries and get to the good stuff.
Donald, where are you right now, by the way? I should ask.
I'm in Lexington.
So you're kind of near ground zero.
Correct. I'm about an hour away from Churchill. I'm based at Keeneland right now in the morning, so that's where my fun is being had.
I would assume a lot of the horses and horsemen are still over at Keeneland, even though they're kind of getting ready for Derby. Is that correct, or does everybody kind of shift over to Louisville if they're pointing for that race?
Yeah, right now I think it's shifting. I had the chance to see War of Will, his last couple drills. Other than that, I think the majority of them are shifting over to the big meet.
Well, we'll talk works and stuff a little bit later on. I just kind of wanted to start a little bit with your guys' stories in relation to the Derby. The Derby is such a unique and different thing than we see at any point during the year. I mean, it's a very singular type of event, and that's obviously why it gets a lot of the singular attention that it does. John, let's start with you. Is the Derby a race that you've fared well with, fared poorly with? What has kind of been your history with the Kentucky Derby?
Mostly poorly. It's such a difficult race. And I would say it's improved in the last, 7 or 8 years as I started playing more seriously and had access to tools like the plot and everything. But, I guess the three segments for me was, it's been like a fan, a kid, going back from 1971. And then during the career period, I just didn't have a lot of time to focus on it. And then, like I said, in the last 10 years, things have changed too. This whole qualifying thing has changed the way you kind of, the horses in the race and how the race is run. I think it's been much more formful, especially probably the last 7 or 8 years. So
I think we've turned a corner to where a lot of people are finally saying, you know what, I'm not going to look for bombs and value. I'm just going to stick with what's worked, because there's a big recency bias in terms of chalk.
Yes. And, there was an interesting story last year that Emily and I kind of experienced because we did the video and, Justified looked so good on the plot and just leading up to the race. He just kind of looked like a strong favorite, and we were trying to figure out how do we make money on the favorite. And we joined we ran the players pool for Twin Spires. And so leave it to me to turn a 5-2 shot into a 1-2 shot. But that's essentially what I did. But the story is that we did the Superfecta and we were focused on Justified, and we had a lot of tickets around Justified. And funny thing is as we put the tickets together, we had a lot of focus on them, but it's always a rush last minute. You got to get these tickets in, and Ed wanted it early, and I thought I had everything laid out. Emily and I did a great job of ranking all the horses by, in the Super 2, not just for win, but for second, third, and fourth. And I felt pretty strong. And so I put it in. My wife goes in, did you check this when you transpose, your rankings to this? I said, no, I don't. Ed needed it really right away, and I didn't do it. So she comes back and says, you messed it up. So at the last minute, the horse that I messed up was in Still Regard. So, we took a horse that we probably should have $7 on the Superfecta, and it turned out to have $2 on it. And so the $25,000 we invested should have been more like, 130, 140, and we only got back 40 because we hit it twice. So, it was one of those, could have been a lot better. Again, our strong opinion was justified, and we really were wrong about Noble Indy, right? We really wrong about that horse. And Mendelssohn had the terrible trip, so that was the other horse we were strong on. So that was our big Derby bet last year, and mixed results, obviously.
John, the guiding portion of my career last year has been blame Ed, so I'm glad that you agree with that method as well. Emily, the Derby, what's kind of been your approach in past years? Do you think you're going to take the same approach this year, or are you maybe changing things up a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, my big Derby hit is still to be made, but yeah, kind of the same approach. And then I think we're doing the players pool again, and so yes, kind of the same approach and working on that. Yeah, my handicapping doesn't really change too much going into these races, I guess.
Donald, as a pro clocker, does your handicapping really tilt towards morning works and what you're seeing both in the morning and the afternoon, or are you using other means for handicapping?
For the Derby, I've generally been someone who steps back and turns myself back into a fan, mainly because my approach has always been I'm very focused on one circuit and where I'm watching the horses train. That's kind of my advantage. So the Derby, since I haven't seen a lot of these horses train up, I can't compare it to anything. I always find it's best to take a step back and know where your weaknesses are. But that doesn't mean, the beauty of the Derby nowadays is there's so much freaking information out there. If you have opinions that you respect, you can find them, and you often can find them for free because everyone wants to be heard on Derby week.
Yeah, I was thinking as a clocker or even as a handicapper, who you end up on as your Derby pick or top couple picks, it can have decent ramifications for the rest of the year for you, right?
Oh, absolutely. These are the pools on Derby days are monstrous. So if you're a serious player and you have a strong opinion, you have to dive in because, as they would say, there's a lot of dead money involved, and it gives you a bigger advantage.
Well, let's talk about the preps. John, I know you have a graphic that you wanted to show, and kind of just wanted to get your guys' opinions about the preps, which ones you like the most, which ones you maybe don't like the most. And obviously, sometimes the horses we like the most might not be coming out of the preps that we love the most, but I do think there generally is some correlation. So, John, let's just kind of start with you and talk about the graphic a little bit and just kind of your general thoughts about the primary preps for the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, so what I took here, this was public information on a website. All the big vendors put their speed figures out for all the different Derby preps, and all I did was kind of did their rankings, which one they thought was the best to the worst. There's some ties in there. And then, so it's Beyer, Brisnet, Timeform, us, OptixEQ, and then just kind of did a consensus in terms of speed figures. So you could see the rankings, the highest rank would be at the top, the Arkansas Derby, the Wood Memorial, the Florida Derby, Louisiana Derby. And that's pretty much, from a visual, doing notes. I did notes for Louisiana and the Wood Memorial. That's pretty much the way I kind of seen the preps. I think that's a pretty good representation of them in terms of equality. So that this kind of, this graphic and the speed figure kind of fits the visual of the Derby. I think the only one that we did have a little bit higher from a speed figure were the Rebel races than most of them. And I thought those races were good. And it's like, those are the horses pretty much coming out of those races went to the Arkansas Derby. I guess San needed too. But so, that's kind of, just an overall assessment of that. I think this looks pretty good.
Emily, your thoughts on the preps, but also I'm always curious to get, because I think you watch a race very, very well, and so I'm always interested to get your feedback. Do sometimes races, to your eye, look better or worse than maybe they came back on some of these speed figures?
Yeah, I think you definitely have to take that into consideration as far as the speed figure, like how the race was won, how the race was run, which horses maybe didn't show up and then kind of helped another horse in a certain way. Things like that, or, the way the track profile was and a certain figure being higher. So I think that's really important information, is to kind of go back through and look how the horse won the race in relationship to the other horses that were in the race.
I think what's interesting too about the chart is for the most part, it kind of flows in agreement with the level of points assigned to it, right? I mean, the Arkansas Derby, the Wood, the Florida Derby, Louisiana, these are all 100-point races. These are all races that theoretically should be the best of the best and getting the higher numbers. And the only one that the two that kind of slipped down are the Bluegrass and the Santa Anita Derby in terms of, their position. But, the outliers toward the bottom are the Risen Star and the Ruby and Tampa, races are kind of in the second part of the prep season. So I think that from a speed figure standpoint, it seems, at least according to the list, that for the most part, John, these numbers kind of run in tandem with the series and the points and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and again, 3-year-olds, right? So they're improving, month to month, right? So you're going to see improvement in speed figures too, right? And they're going to run their better races toward the, later in the year. Obviously, they get better. I think it's like on our scales, I think we're about 1.5 points almost per month. A 3-year-old will improve in general.
Okay.
So,
John, let me ask you about the Optix speed figures. How do you kind of compare them to some of the other ones? The methodologies, or do they end up much different in general, or just give us a little background on those?
Fairly similar. I think the way we do our daily variant is, more. We look at the race shape in forming the daily variant. I don't know, again, specifically how other folks do that specifically, but not too dramatically different, but that's just probably, I was going to mention a difference on how we do speed figures, but it's just pretty much the same way kind of other folks do it. I just say that would be the one difference. We look at the variant, because some days you'll see, a race shape that's kind of really slow early and fast late, and how do you deal with that? And so we have a way of actually understanding that and getting to a better figure, and it's not just, it's based on models plus, some subjective, but it's less subjective than maybe some way some others do that.
Let's talk a little bit about your guys' which preps you kind of liked and which preps you kind of didn't like. We'll kind of keep the same rotation going, and John, we'll start with you. Just kind of ones that jumped out to you as maybe stronger preps, because I think that's what a lot of people will be grading is, I'm tossing everything from the Louisiana, or I'm playing all the top 3 in the Arkansas. People do tend to gravitate towards certain preps as being elevated or being decreased.
Yeah, in general, I don't have one that I prefer over the others, because they were all kind of a little different. Like the Wood Memorial was a disaster, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there was so much traffic and trouble. So it's hard to rate horses. So you have to look at each individual horse. And so, for instance, Tax really benefited from his trip, right? He stayed clear of the trouble. So that's one thing. The Florida Derby was just never expected that kind of race, right? Where the pace was completely backed up. So that one to me is, I would kind of upgrade the horses that are trying to come off the pace in that race. And I thought the Arkansas Derby was probably the best overall. I just think those 2 horses were quality, but I'm just still not completely enamored and, with them, because I think each of them, especially in the Omaha Beach, has gotten kind of the benefit of trips, but he's been good. He's done everything they've asked of him. So, it's not just, there's not one I prefer, but there might be horses in those races that either I'll upgrade or downgrade just based on the circumstances and the dynamics of that race.
Emily, what about you? Your thoughts on the preps throughout the season?
Yeah, I kind of agree with John, and I don't really have a standout race this year. I mean, I thought that I thought there was some quality in the Arkansas Derby for sure, and then same thing with Florida Derby, just as far as there being like depth of good horses and the number of those horses that show up in this race, that kind of common races type thing. But there really hasn't been one that I feel was like kind of the key race, so to speak, coming into this.
Emily, one of the things I wrote in the outline is efforts that are kind of dressed up. And what I was getting at with that is I do think sometimes we see horses who end up running big races that maybe aren't, maybe we should tone down the hyperbole of how great they are because of that. And I think that the universal sentiment seems that the Florida Derby was kind of that race this year just because of how it's set up for maximum security. Is that one that you think was maybe a little bit dressed up, or are there others that you think maybe came back better on paper than maybe they were because of one reason or another?
Yeah, I think that the Florida Derby is kind of a great example of that. And then just, the way that Gulfstream plays in general, it just kind of worked out for that horse, for the winner, maximum security, and then kind of against the others. But one of the other things, and I don't know if John wants to quite pull up the grid yet, but we have the keywords in Optics Grid, and a lot of those keywords will have red keywords assigned with them. So I think that's kind of a good sort of jumping off point when you're looking at, was this a good trip or a bad trip? Did this horse have something favorable? And you see those red keywords, and you kind of know this horse had something favorable happen. And, looking through this field, there's quite a number of horses in this race that have, the Tactic Plus, the Great Ride, or Perfect, Easy Lead, like we just saw. And those are ones that I would take kind of with a grain of salt, maybe a little bit flattered off that type of effort. You can see it's just kind of scrolling through. There's quite a few of them, and like my kind of preliminary handicapping would be look at the horses that don't have red keywords.
Donald, when you're, as you said, I think one of the things that is a benefit of your handicapping, your style, is that you're locked in and focused on one or two particular circuits. Did you have some prep races this year that you got to see or see workers for that particularly impressed you?
I'm kind of on I guess the popular opinion that the Arkansas Derby for me was the standout. I think those are two of the arguably the most talented horses we have. Omaha Beach, who was never really on my radar, I was super impressed with that win, because in my mind, Improbable is the real thing, and he was never in danger of getting past. And I was just visually, I was quite impressed. Like John said, the horse is carving out these ideal trips, but there might just be something to do with you have that kind of talent and you find a way. The fact that the horse moved actually makes an early move, and it's noted on the notes. You just don't see horses do that, make an early move, then settle, and then have that main rival kind of, you hear the footsteps, and then there's just never a doubt. So in my mind, the Arkansas Derby is best. Second, I would probably go the Fairgrounds race, and then it's well behind for the other races.
What was it about the Fairgrounds race you like? Because I do feel like By My Standards is getting a little bit of buzz from a few people I've heard from.
I've only watched the race a couple times. It was the gut reaction the first time I saw the race. I remember talking to John afterwards, where it had the feel that the top two were really putting in serious efforts. And I can't really say much more than that. Sometimes you just, you see enough races over time, you have to rely on your initial response. And that's kind of was my initial reaction to that race.
Well, I think, we see the initial responses thanks to social media, and there's a lot of preps where the second it's over, you see 10 people say, well, we didn't see the Derby winner out of there. And I don't think that we necessarily saw that after Louisiana Derby. And it's a race that hasn't produced all that well come Kentucky Derby in the last year. So I do think people are actually a little hesitant to give that race props. So it's interesting to hear you say that. Well, guys, let's take our first little short time out here on our taping, and when we come back in 4 seconds, we're going to start digging into the plot and start talking about the pace and much more here on the Optics Pre-Derby Chat. All right, welcome back to our Optics Plot pre-Derby conversation. Jason Beem, John Doyle, Emily Gullickson, and Donald Harris here with you. And we're now going to shift into discussing Optics Plot, the potential pace scenario here in this year's Kentucky Derby. And I do want to mention that the plot will include horses who are not necessarily in the top 20 right now. As we know, every year there can be defections, there could be horses that come out, and so worth keeping the another twist of fates and those types on the plot. And so if you see 24, 25 numbers, that's why. But John, let's start out with talking a little bit about plot trends. You have a graphic up on the screen right now that kind of shows, at least through about the last 11 years or so, where the Derby winners have come from. I'll let you kind of take over and discuss that.
Sure, correct. And you can see quadrant one, which is not an abnormal thing, right? Racing, especially in North America, horses that are usually forwardly placed do well. And you can see quadrant one has dominated. Now, quadrant one does have the most runners. However, it still has the highest percentage by far of winners, win percent too. So just keep that in mind. You can see, so even if you're a quadrant one, you square a circle, you have a very good chance of winning the Derby. Okay, that's probably your best chance. Q3 squares have done pretty well. And we have one, Mind That Bird was one of the Q3 circles that win, but they normally don't do that well, Q3 circles. I think everyone could say that was kind of an anomaly, that race in that year. Even Tom Durkin could say that. So I would just say that was take a look at that. Quadrant 1 is the dominant. Quadrant 4 has a lot of runners, but they do very poorly. They haven't won. But they do have a good chance to run second. Q4 squares are the best to run underneath. Quadrant 2 here and quadrant 4, if you're a circle, you're really up against it. In fact, you're a quadrant 4 circle, and that would make sense, right? Because if you circle means that you don't have the late pace relative to the other horses to close. And if you're all the way back, and that's what quadrant 4, you're going to get your deep closers, you're going to get your finishes in quadrant 4. If they're in that position and they don't have the close to run on these horses, circle meaning you don't have a good late pace relative to the rest of the field, you're really up against it. So they really become eliminations over the year. So late pace is the key again. So upgrade the squares because they have the best late pace. And when you're talking about a mile and a quarter, for these horses are all doing it for the first time, that's where you really want to be. Other than if you're forwardly placed, and that's the only chance you really have. In the Derby, if you're in quadrant 1, you're a circle. If you're anywhere else in a circle, you're really up against it.
John, can I ask a little bit of a plot newbie question? All the symbols and locations and stuff, these are all relative to against this specific field, right? One horse that's a quadrant 2 circle one day might be a quadrant 1 square the next race, right? That's
correct. That's right. Good point. Okay. And just like if a horse dropped in class, he's running against inferior horses, he might look a lot different on the fly.
Okay.
Right?
Great. Okay. Yeah. I think it's a good graphic to take. I'm also very fascinated just looking at it with the 05 Derby where Giacomo and Closing Argument, another race that kind of fell apart and, those happen every once in a while. So I'm kind of curious to see where they would have fit in on the plot.
Yeah. And you can see some of the odd races, in my opinion. Always Dreaming to me was an odd race, even though he was a square in quadrant 3. Mind That Bird and Orb all did it on a sealed track, and the other one I didn't really quite like was Super Save. All did it on that sealed track. So we'll talk about weather later, but that plays a huge role in the results of the race. Justified did it last year. He just was a superior horse, in my opinion. Yeah. So,
well, let's pull up the plot, and Emily, I'll start with you because. I know when I first open an Optix plot, I kind of have a little method of what I'm going to go through and scan and look for. And I think similar to other past performances, right? You kind of open up, you maybe look for a favorite or certain trainers at certain places. But Emily, when you open up this plot for the first time, how do you kind of approach reading it? What do you start with, and what are the first things that kind of jump out to you?
Yeah, I always kind of want to start with the top, the plot fit, the contention, and the speed rating, because I think that does kind of help give the overall race shape. I mean, having information as far as where the horses are winning from and where you have an advantage is important information. That as far as like a pace analysis, like what, is the pace going to be contentious and is the pace going to be hot? Because sometimes those aren't, those don't necessarily mean the same thing. There could be a lot of contention up front and the pace being really slow, or, a high speed rating, but not as much contention and then kind of a spaced out field. So that's sort of the first place that I start is looking at those two things. And you can see, it's kind of interesting because then, scrolling down to the Optix RPM, there's no real E types. There's no real horses that are like, need the lead, I need to be on the front end. But you have a group of horses that are EP types, but also worth keeping in mind, 21, 23 are not in the field yet. So, kind of being a horse that's forwardly placed, maybe this really does set up for them, or you start looking at, getting into trips, getting a little bit deeper, or some of those PC types, can be more forwardly placed. But that's sort of where I start. Looking at that and then comparing that with the plot.
Yeah, Emily, I think one of my theories so far in this Derby is I think that Maximum Security could possibly end up in a little bit of a similar situation that he did in the Florida Derby, and obviously his square looms a little bit there on the front side of the page, as well as Gray Magician, who is obviously the big circle that kind of jumps out on you. And do you think Gray Magician is maybe someone that can be a little bit of a spoiler in this race?
Well, I mean, clearly they kind of have one option, right? They're gonna have to go and hope for the best. But yeah, I mean, when the running starts to kick in, that's gonna be, you can almost see the keyword no keep kicking in right away with that big circle. But yeah, a horse like that, even a horse like Maximum Security, they have to go with sort of best, what got them there, right, is being in the front and taking their shot, and that's probably where those two horses are going to be.
Yeah, and Jason, you notice where maximum security is down on the y-axis, right? He's kind of lower on the y-axis, and you say, why is that? That just tells me he's been coming out of races where the pace has been soft.
Yeah. And
he's been able to finish. So, if he has to go faster now, don't know. This pace scenario is kind of muddled, right? It doesn't look like Emily's point. But if he has to go faster to get that lead, or stress more to get that lead, what are we going to see? And I think, that's where class is going to tell him. We'll see what he has. But that's why he's lower. So like Justified last year was like up here. Okay. So he had both. He both had the early positional speed, and he had the kind of the second call speed to dominate a race. So it's a little different. Again, this pace scenario is not much, so there's a possibility. But he's just come out of races, obviously, that the middle fractions have been softer, and that was what we were talking about in the Florida Derby.
Donald, I'd be curious to get your opinion on this, because I feel like the Derby is often thought of as, there's always going to be pace in the Kentucky Derby. And I think part of that, at least for me, I always think about, you got to throw in the 150,000 people, and the entire first quarter is run by the stands and the adrenaline and everything like that. But we saw American Pharoah's year. It didn't really boil over up front. I don't recall Nyquist's year, but do you think that, Donald, is the atmosphere, the crowd, the quarter mile to the first turn, does that tend, do you think, lend itself to horses maybe going a little faster than they'd want to early?
That's an interesting point. I can't see why not. Any atmosphere in any sporting event is bound to create some changing possibilities, and not just with the horses getting excited, but we're still talking about the humans on top of these riders, and maybe you have someone with a little less experience who gets a little too excited and pushes it a little bit too hard. But tactically, with the way the point system has changed everything, where we don't have these 6 furlong runoffs, it really is going to be a fascinating first quarter mile, which what these riders do who actually have some early speed, like a horse like War of Will, who I think could be crazy dangerous if he sits his trip. And he's another horse that could be finished dead last if he doesn't get his trip. So it's just a lot of fun. This year's Derby is truly interesting.
Yeah. Donald, what did you make of War Will's effort in the Louisiana Derby? Because obviously he was kind of a no-show that day, but he's really had been so good before that. I feel like he's a little bit forgotten.
It's interesting going into that race. I think I even made a comment that horse just isn't for me. I didn't like the way he had a tendency possibly to get ranked behind horses and not settle. But after that poor effort, which I think there's a borderline excuse. There was a really awkward step that he took early in that race. And I don't think it was a lame excuse. I think it was a legitimate excuse. And the couple drills I've seen, it looks like he's back to his kind of high motoring ways in the mornings. So I kind of like the idea of a horse that shows an ugly running line. If you have a reason to draw a line through it, and you get a price, I think you gotta take a long look.
Yeah, I just thought he was so professional in the Risen Star. If you want, when Country House is kind of lugging in and stuff, he's just going straight as a string and looked pretty smooth. John, you're bringing up the note stuff. Is there something you wanted to point out here?
I just wanted the comments that Donald had on War of Will. The concern I had, and it was really based on a comment Donald had in one of his previous races. I'm trying to remember where it was. But I think he was concerned about this horse rating behind horses, and that's my concern. I would love to see this horse get like post position 18, 20 or something like that, where he can maybe stalk outside horses, because I think, I don't know, I just haven't seen him run behind horses yet. He just didn't look comfortable at all. I had him almost like, he looked like I thought he injured himself out of the gate, because he just didn't look himself that race. So
he didn't have he naturally has a tug. I'm sorry, John. He naturally has a tug mentality where he takes a big hold of the bit and just wants to go. Now, in those perfect trips, they got him outside, so he was able to relax somewhat. But goes back to what I had mentioned earlier. A horse that has a natural green light action to him, who just wants to go, when it comes to sitting in like a covered up spot, generally they're not going to react the right way. You add on top of that a 20-horse freaking field, and most of the time they're just going to lose their mind.
Key to this whole thing is, the draw, right? How they draw. And I would think that just knowing Baffert, he kind of senses I think he's one of the few trainers that understands how to strategize a race better than anyone. Most trainers just go in and tell the jockey, do what comes to you, right? And I think Baffert is much more strategic. I think that's one of his edges. And I think he's going to say to this race, we're going, right? And I don't know who, I know who he's going to go with, but I could guarantee one of his horses is going to run more close than they've been before, right? I think, between Improbable, a game winner, one of those horses is going to, I think, be really in the mix early. So that's going to be interesting to see. So post positions and strategies out of that gate is going to be key, especially for a horse like War of Will, who I'm concerned about, being inside horses, inside other speed.
And John, I'll kind of reference this in context of War of Will. There was a race that he came out of, I believe it was the Risen Star, where a lot of talk was made about this horse being in post 13, and he's going to get a super wide trip, and that was kind of like all the chatter. And one, we had the great note that being outside is going to benefit. But when I did the pace scenario, because I ended up writing up that race, I think for ABR, there wasn't as much speed. So being in post 13, it didn't really matter for him because there was like one other horse drawn to his outside or one drawn to his inside, and just to be able to clear because he's faster. So when you're looking at post position in relationship to pace, you have to consider, where is the speed? Is it to the inside, is the outside, and how is that going to impact this particular horse?
Yes.
Emily, I wanted to push forward on the plot itself, and one of the things I always am still working on learning is kind of interpreting the horses that end up kind of being close to the middle of the plot, because there often it will be a small glut of them, kind of in and around with similar size squares and so stuff like that. Talk about some of these horses that maybe are kind of in that spot with the plot, maybe some smaller squares, like Tax, like, who's the Roadster, like, Improbable, like Cutting Humor, those kind of runners.
Yeah, it's going to be one of those things that once the field draws and you kind of have those 21, 23, 24, I mean, because it's in relationship to each other, it'll change slightly. And then again, the post position. So that's kind of something more I'm going to do finalize, and then again, compare that with the grid, look at trips, look at rider tendencies, where horses are in their form cycle as far as, is this post going to kind of upgrade, downgrade in terms of trip that way? Because, if you look at, what's circled in the picture right now, I mean, if you don't know the names, there's really not much separation between those horses, right? I mean, Tax could be any one of those horses, and I don't even know, like Cutting Humor being another. They're really hard to separate from there.
I think Tax is the 14, actually. Yeah.
Or sorry, Tacitus. I'm sorry, Tacitus, not Tacitus. 1, 15, 11, 6. Those horses 5 are really quite similar.
John, at this early stage of the whole thing, like Emily said, obviously the draw is going to impact a lot of this stuff. Are you finding that you're looking more to toss certain horses? Are you looking more to elevate certain horses right now? Do you have many strong opinions, or is it really a matter of you just kind of have to wait to see how the field shakes up?
I think I have pretty good opinion right now. Again, the plot might change some things, but my handicapping approach is to eliminate horses as much as possible, and then downgrade or upgrade horses, and then kind of look where the price might fit in relation. So, there's certain horses, for instance, that obviously there's strong win contenders in Omaha Beach and stuff, but I'm not crazy about him just because I just think price and trip and all the rest is something I'm concerned about. I'm kind of negative on Maximum Security, and there's certain horses, like for instance, I'll just do handicapping, and I'll look at a horse like Tax and say, okay, I don't think this horse got a perfect trip. He stayed out of the trouble of Wood Memorial, but I don't think the horse is a 1.25 mile horse. But then I kind of look at the plot and I say, look, I need to reconsider that. So those are some of the things I'll do, like upgrade him on the plot, but I don't really particularly like him. The horse that's kind of been coming into focus for me, and he's a Q2 squared. The last two Q squared winner was Orb, is Code of Honor. I just think he showed potential at 2. Let me just bring up his. Let me just go to him for a second here. So I'll just show you what I mean. He showed a good race in the Champagne figure-wise. So, again, we talk about horses improving. So number-wise, I think he fits. I think he got a benefit of the trip, but was off a layoff in the Fountain of Youth. But he was completely up against it in that Florida Derby. I thought he still ran on pretty well. And I think he's pretty athletic. He's a horse that's been able to get out of trouble. Has been a horse that's been able to come from behind that. But I don't think he's going to be all that far. I think he might be mid-pack and make a run. And so he's one horse that, again, depending on the odds, is one that I'm kind of considering.
Well, last little part I wanted to ask, and this is going to be more of a Donald-centric question, I think. What do we want to see in the next, week and 10 days until the Kentucky Derby? Because there's obviously, in the mornings, there's a lot of coverage, there's a lot of talk. You got everybody posting workouts at their phone. Donald, I think also everybody becomes a workout expert for 2 weeks, even though you spend 52 weeks a year doing it. What are some of the things you're most looking for horses? And is maybe sometimes I always feel like the best information isn't who's doing good, it's who's doing bad.
No, absolutely. That's a great point. For people out there who are looking for to get through the massive information that's going to be thrown out there, I think you have to decide the opinions you respect, and then try and find those that are comparing the horses how they look now from what they did 2 or 3 months ago. And that's where you're going to find a true value. Someone who just says this horse is doing great and doesn't actually follow it up with this is the way the horse looked 3 months ago, it doesn't mean anything. People who have actually seen the horse grow up as a 3-year-old, have seen him on a daily basis and have seen changes, negative or positive, that's when you actually have something that you can take to the windows. Other than that, it's just a lot of noise.
Well, because that's a big part of handicapping 3-year-olds, right? Is that they are growing and evolving. I mean, these are, maybe comparing them to adults. I mean, these are guys going from high school to college and still growing up, right?
Right. And, certain horses have certain personalities that are going to lend itself to the Derby madness, and others, it might be the exact opposite. What's that horse back in the day? It was Shackelford, who would always wash out, and if you didn't know he would constantly get washy, you would end up tossing him, and I think he ended up with the Preakness?
One of the Preakness, yeah.
But it's just you need to know these horses and how they act on a daily basis to have a good measuring stick coming up to watch, all these people who watch the horses work out for 1 week leading up to the Derby, and they think they have the answer.
Emily, do you spend a lot of time watching the works this next couple of weeks?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've also have somewhat of a background. I've clocked horses in the past and following these horses, and I've watched the workouts when they're made available, regardless of the XBTV that films them in the morning. So I've been kind of following them, not just going to jump in at the last minute, but definitely a piece that I'm looking for. And again, like Donald said, I'm kind of looking for any type of changes, positive or negative, and I've already kind of set one and Donald this week, and it's important to just understand context with workouts as far as, like he mentioned, the horse's tendency, and having that context is super important for analyzing those workouts.
And I would think also just knowing who the trainers are. I think we saw with Maximum Security, he did kind of a slow 3 furlongs, and I saw a few people were like, oh man, what's going on? And then everybody else was like, no, that's how Jason Service trains it. And Donald, I would think, do you find that most trainers kind of have patterns with how they work their horses?
Yeah, I think the majority of them work them all the same. And then there's the magic man, Service, who trots them around 1.25 miles and explodes.
Well, we'll see if the magic can continue in 10 days. Like I said, I feel like Maximum Security is one of mine that I'm liking, and I know some people are, some people aren't. Which, you can make cases for and against pretty much every horse in here. That's kind of one of the interesting things about the Derby. And but the good news is you only got to be right every so often because the pools are so big.
I love the idea of Maximum Security winning because there'll be a movie based on the fact that you could have claimed them for 16.
Absolutely. Well, guys, let's take another little break, and we come out. We'll start getting a little bit more of your guys' stronger opinions, who you like a little bit right now. Still, a week and a half, 2 weeks out, and also want to talk about weather because it's obviously been a big issue in derbies in recent times. So let's take a short break, and we'll be right back. It's the Optics Derby Pre. Continuing our Derby Optics pre-chat, Optics pre-Derby chat. There we go. I got to get my notes right. Jason Beem from Bet America here with you, joined along by John Doyle and Emily Gullickson from OptixEQ, Donald Harris from OptixEQ as well, Clocker to the Stars. And want to talk about the weather to kind of lead off this segment. And John, I'll start with you because in recent years, weather has been a big factor in the Derby. I mean, just because we've had some big weather days. I mean, Orb, Justify are some of the ones that kind of jump to mind. But weather can also, at least if you're handicapping with optics, which is good, I think, because it kind of makes the PP a little bit more interactive. I mean, it can change how things go, right?
Sure. Well, we don't actually change for sloppy tracks, so we don't do that because the reason is, Jason, is because there's just so many variations of a wet track. There's seal, there's sloppy, there's muddy, and just it's hard to kind of really figure out which one it is. So it's always tricky, especially Churchill. I mean, 6 out of the last 12 years, I think they've had rain, and so it's always difficult. And the way the track dries out, the way they maintain it during the day, it's really difficult. It makes the handicapping really difficult. You just got to kind of pay attention, see how the rail does, because I think in 2 of those derbies, the rail was really good, and that helped Super Saver and Always Dreaming, 2 horses that benefited from a bias. So you got to just pay attention during the day. Let's hope it's a dry day because I think we have our best results and our best racing when it is dry.
Yeah, I mean, that bird came from the clouds to win his year when it was in the slop. Emily, how important is it to watch the undercard races to get a feel for the Derby, and has that in years past changed your betting approach once we get to the 12th race?
Yeah, I mean, it can. If there's things that really need to be like upgraded, downgraded throughout the day, but I think it's important if you are going to make those changes and make those assessments that it is something that you're practiced with. I mean, watching a race, watching for a bias is tricky because you have to know that track, you have to know those particular horses, you have to know a lot of information going in order to determine, like, and see results that are kind of wacky. Like, we would have never got that result unless that track was playing that particular way. And a lot of times people can be reactive, right? They'll see a horse on the inside win and be on the front end. And it's like, oh my God, inside speed bias. And you're like, well, actually that horse kind of made sense to win on the front end. So let's not quite jump to conclusions yet. Let's get something really wacky, and then you can start making those decisions. So I think that's important, is to just not be super reactionary if you see those results. But yeah, I mean, kind of early reports. I mean, we might have a fast and firm Oaks and Derby day, so my fingers are crossed.
Donald, if you've been at Keeneland, and obviously the weather has been a little up and down there, as it kind of is every year, right? I mean, there's always 1 or 2 sloppy days there. Do you notice that particular track changes much when it goes from regular fast surface to sloppy? I mean, does the profile change much, or does it just kind of stay the same, just everybody gets more dirty?
Yeah, I haven't seen too many crazy biases at Keeneland. I've only really done the meet a couple times, so my sample size isn't huge. I think Churchill lends itself more on the big days to possibly come up with severe biases. I'd be curious to know what Emily and John think. When it comes to bias racetracks, I am far from a top level guy for figuring that out. I respect the way Emily and John come up with their opinions on that, so I'd ask them what they think.
Good segue, Donald. Emily, I'll start with you. I think some people are very quick to point out biases when one horse goes to the wire. What are kind of the key things you're looking for before you kind of start making that pronouncement, not only publicly, but just kind of in your head?
I would actually, I know this is kind of weird, but watch horses like in the running, horses that are off the pace, and just kind of see like the flow of the race, like not looking at individual horses, but if you see horses that are on those inside paths, regardless of whether like in the front, middle, or back, but if those horses kind of continue to go forward and the horses that are on the outside either kind of stay in the same spot or go backwards, that's kind of something that to me indicates there's something funky going on, because that's not normal, right? Like, everybody should be constantly progressing, like going forward, unless maybe, one horse is no keep or something like that. But there shouldn't be like, one system going one way and one system going the other way. So that's kind of something I look for. And then things that are, horses not being able to close, or horses in certain spots they're just backing up, even though they shouldn't be, like the race shape doesn't favor them. So that's kind of what I look for. Just things that when you watch races day in and day out, something that's weird, something that's different than how normal horse races run.
Yeah, with the closers, I always look for closers who look visually like they're running well, but still not gaining any ground. Those are always kind of, to me, that's always like one of the, because there's sometimes where jocks are pushing along and you can tell they're just laboring and they're not making up ground, but the ones who literally visually look like they're really climbing into the race nicely and just, but aren't gaining ground. That's always my kind of eye detector.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially, when you look at the times of the race, like that horse should be closing, like that horse should definitely be gaining ground. Those fractions were fast enough. That's another really good indicator.
John, what about you? How do you go upon spotting potential biases in a racetrack?
Yeah, the first thing you have to do is handicap the races that day. I think if you don't and try to come up with a bias, you're going to be up against it and not be accurate. So you have to know, like, for instance, who's going to be in front, who's going to be in back. And if you just, like what you guys said, if you see things that doesn't make sense, right? I've been watching races for, 40 years. That doesn't make sense. Then I kind of pay attention. And you got to separate, sometimes with these wet tracks, people think it's a bias. Sometimes horses just don't handle tracks. I wouldn't call that a bias. I want races that are run like normal, before I really consider bias, because I think that's where you're going to get your value. You're going to, it's a little bit more subtle. But if the one thing I just start saying, if you start seeing horses that are 10, 20 to 1 start to win, start paying attention and find out how they're winning and make sure that it's either they're up, somebody missed something, or these horses are benefiting, and that's a great indicator. Just a long shot's winning, and why, and are they winning the similar way?
Well, guys, the beauty of a pre-Derby chat is we don't have to give out any picks today, but I am curious to see, a week and a half, 2 weeks out, right now, which horses are kind of, most exciting to your guys' eye. And obviously, like I said, the draw still has to happen and defections and works and everything else. But, John, why don't we just start with you? Who are kind of making your list right now?
Yeah, I was kind of a little premature on it, but, before. So I did say Code of Honor. I thought, he's going to make my list. I think he's, I think he's got potential. He's overcome trouble. I think he is athletic enough, and I think he just was up against the flow, as you see there, the key word in the Florida Derby.
Emily, what about you? Oh, did we lose Emily?
No, I'm here.
Oh,
no, I'm here. Yeah, I was a little premature as well. It kind of gave that. I'm focusing on the horses that don't have the red keywords. So, kind of looking at those horses just right off the bat. I mean, I don't have a pick right now. I'm not really in love with any of these horses. I mean, if you follow me on Twitter, you saw my tweet a few weeks ago. The horse that I like the least, or of them is Win. He's one of the horses that doesn't have any red keywords, and those are sort of the ones that I'm looking at right now. I know he's kind of down there in 16, but a lot of green, a lot of black, kind of going from that position up. Spin off kind of say the same thing. Cutting humor, improbable. There's not many by my standards fits in that. So those are kind of ones that, because I don't really have anybody, I just trust the data and kind of give those horses a look right now.
Donald, any favorites for you so far?
Pause for effect. I learned this from Emily. Let's go to 13. John, could you throw up 13? I think it's 13. I think it's Long Range Toddy. Yeah, this is the one price horse that I'm curious about, because I've actually talked to John about this one. He felt like an evolving horse that just kept kind of creeping forward each race. I loved his Rebel. I just thought it was a fantastic effort. And then he jumped in the Arkansas Derby over a sloppy track, and he laid an absolute egg. It was a really disappointing effort. But the fact is, there's no reason that couldn't be considered a bit of a bounce, a bit of a regression, and then he could train back up to another peak effort heading into the Kentucky Derby. So after those ugly efforts, you always have a chance to get a better price. And the fact that he's proven he can sit in traffic and then finish is a quality that I love. So he's a price horse that I'll keep an eye on and see how he's acting heading into the big race.
Yeah, when I talked about the recency effects and the fact that favorites have been winning, the fact that nobody's won the Derby, I think, since Animal Kingdom without having a perfect 3-year-old season. I mean, it's just been a trend lately, and I think that people have become very unforgiving for bad efforts. But unforgiving is where you find, or being forgiving is where you find your prices. So I think that in the long term, it's worth doing, because what people forget, and I think people talk so much about winning the Derby, that you heard John say it's been more losing than winning. That's going to be the case for every type of race. And so it's just a matter of when you do capitalize, getting paid for it. And, one good Derby can make up for 15 years of bad Derbies really, really quick. I mean, Ken Rudolph's still making a living off Giacomo, for God's sake. Well, guys, that's all I got. John, anything you want to add before we wrap up?
Just want to let you know that we do have a Derby special. It includes the latest plot for Oaks and also the Derby, and we're going to be doing some things on there also in terms of we did all the preps, so you could get that analysis. You can get the horse by horse analysis from us for the Derby and the Oaks, and some spot plays and some Pick 4 tickets, all for $50, and it includes not just the Derby tracks, but all the tracks of that day, notes and the plot. So check it out, OptixEQ.com.
Emily, any parting words?
No, I mean, I think that covers it. I mean, this special is kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it's kind of our regular weekend special. We're just throwing a lot of stuff in there. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the draw and see how it comes out. I've been asked to do full card selections on Brisnet, so that might happen as well. But yeah, a lot of good stuff for this weekend.
And Donald, you can do your 3-second pause and then come in with any final thoughts.
I just feel fortunate to be on this podcast to up my Q rating.
Well, Q rating's important, and if you guys want to add to Donald's Q rating, you can find him on Twitter. He's at Clocker DH. Emily is at Emily OptixEQ. John Doyle is at John Doyle AZ. Is that right, John?
That's correct.
All right, perfect. Well, guys, thank you so much. And again, folks, head to OptixEQ.com to check out any of the things that you saw on here. And as I said, you can find us all on social media. We're all moderately responsive, I think. So we'll be, hope everybody has a great Derby. Thanks so much.